So next we have Billie Rinaldi, who is a senior member of the technical staff at Hortonworks, and she's also the chairperson of the Accumulo PMC. Billie?
Hi, can everybody hear me? Great. So I'm going to talk about deploying and managing Accumulo on Yarn using a new incubator project called Apache Slider. I'm going to cover sort of briefly what Yarn is and how it works and why you'd want to run Accumulo on it. And then I'm going to explain like the gaps that Slider is trying to fill and how you actually deploy and manage Accumulo on Slider. So in the beginning, there was Hadoop 1, and there wasn't really any sort of resource management framework. MapReduce had its own resource management along with its like data processing model. But if you wanted to run another application on top of HDFS, you either had to sort of try to execute your app as a MapReduce job, or you were left to do a lot of manual resource management. So you had to like carve out a specific set of your resources and reduce the resources that MapReduce was allowed to manage. So in Hadoop 2, that resource management piece is split out from MapReduce. It's its own layer called Yarn, and MapReduce uses it for its resource management, and now other apps can take advantage of that as well. So in addition to not having to do that manual resource management of different apps yourself, it also allows a lot more flexibility with your app. You can do dynamic resource allocation, self-healing, elastic, transient clusters. You can have different users running different versions of the same application, and it's all sort of a lot easier to manage. And ideally, it's moving towards a situation where you can more efficiently utilize your cluster because you haven't like set aside large portions of it for something that might not be actually using those resources all the time. So this is basically how Yarn works. There's one resource manager process that's like a master, and then all of the rest of the nodes on the cluster are running node managers. The node manager's heartbeat to the resource manager, while the resource manager does the like resource scheduling, it allocates containers to applications. The node managers themselves start the containers and then report container health to the resource manager. So as a client, your client comes, talks to the resource manager, and asks for its first container, and that first container is used for the application master. Each application on Yarn needs to have an application master, so like each, in the old days, like the equivalent of each MapReduce job will have its own app master. The app master is then responsible for talking to the resource manager and getting more containers for any other processes that application wants to run. It then talks to node managers, and through those node managers starts up the containers. If a container or an entire node manager goes down, the resource manager will find out about it. It will inform the app master, and then the app master can take action based on that, such as requesting a new container. So everything's solved now, right? So actually, it's still pretty difficult to write a Yarn application yourself. There's a bunch of Java code, and while there are starting to become like some easier APIs wrapping the Yarn API, for example, there's an incubator project called Twill. There's still a lot of common issues to solve. Like, how do I do my packaging and configuration of my application? How do I do my debugging? How do I do management and monitoring? What if I have a dependency on another application? There's sort of a lot of things that it would be better if we solved one time, and then sort of everybody could use these common design patterns. And then sort of one last really major issue to consider is that kind of the first proving app for Yarn was MapReduce. And MapReduce has certain like container life cycles. For example, the containers are expected to finish at some point. Whereas for other applications, which we'll call long-lived applications, like Accumulo, the processes don't ever stop unless you manually ask them to come down. So if a process is down and you didn't ask it to be, that's like something you need to intervene about. So while Yarn is a general purpose framework, it still has some improvements that can be done to make it work well for these long-lived applications. So this is where Apache Slider comes in. It's a brand new incubator project, about a month old. And the goal is to make it easy to run long-lived applications such as Accumulo on Yarn. A bit of history, it started about a year ago as a project called Hoya, which you may or may not have heard of. It was not an Apache project, just a project up on GitHub, and it only worked for HBase. But soon after that, there were sort of pluggable providers. So there was an HBase provider and an Accumulo provider. Those providers were still pretty serious pieces of Java code, even though Hoya was doing some of the Yarn interaction itself. So now we've moved to the model of having there just be one agent provider, and that's the whole Java piece. And then there are app packages for different applications, including Accumulo, HBase, and Storm so far. These app packages, I'll go into a bit more detail about their structure, but they basically contain an application tarball and then a bunch of configuration files and scripts. Basically the goals are for Slider to be able to do management operations on these long-lived applications, such as starting, stopping, reconfiguring, rolling restart, decommissioning, et cetera. We haven't gotten to all of those operations yet, but I'll tell you about where we are. Let's see. And so yeah, also we want to be able to detect these failures of these processes that aren't supposed to go down, manage logs, and do monitoring. A few definitions that I haven't covered yet. There's still an application master for Slider, but you don't have to write your own application master anymore. There's the agent provider, which runs in the application master. There's an agent process that each container will start, and the container is what starts individual application processes, which we'll call component instances. Here, a component is say an individual Accumulo process, such as an Accumulo T server or a master, and an instance of it would be one specific running instance of a T server. There's the app package, which is everything that Slider needs to know to be able to deploy the application. Slider has a command line interface, and then sort of one last important element is the registry. So once you've started all your processes on various nodes, and you don't know which nodes they might be started on and which ports they might be started on, you want to be able to write that information to a well-known place. So this would be the registry. So for Accumulo, something we would want to put in the registry is the location of the monitor URL. Other things we would want to put in here would be like maybe anything that a client would need to know to connect to the application. So the slider startup process is very similar to the generic Yarn application startup process. The CLI talks to the resource manager, which creates an app master. The app master requests containers. Containers start up agents. The agent is what pulls in the app package and sort of unpacks it and starts configuring it. Agent registers itself with the AM and then receives commands. And then the agent sort of passes the commands along to component instances. Let's see, agents report back status, and then the app master is what publishes things like the monitor URL information to the registry. So far, the commands that sort of every component instance should be able to accept are install, start, stop, and status. And then applications have the option of defining additional commands like decommission or what have you. Let's see. So this sort of goes through all the steps in a slider create command. There are a few other commands you can execute through the slider CLI. One is to freeze a running application, which brings down all of its processes, but the application data and configuration is still there, so the processes can be started back up. To start them back up is a thaw command. If the cluster is frozen, then you can destroy it, which means bring the processes down and get rid of all the data. And then there's also a flex command, which means change something about the configuration, mainly, say, increase the number of T servers. Let's see. So here are, I'm going to start to go through the details of the app package for Accumulo that lets it run on Slider. So at the root directory, there's the meta info XML and a couple of JSON files. Those are all telling Slider about the app package, basically. And I'll go into those in more detail. In the package directory, we have basically all the Accumulo files. Under files, there's the actual tarball and a bunch of static configuration files. These are just going to be copied into the Accumulo configuration directory when configuring Accumulo. In the templates directory, it's not quite a static configuration file, but some variables are going to be filled in that file. Specifically the Hadoop and Zookeeper home and the heap sizes and whatnot. And then there's a directory of scripts. While the other configuration files are basically straight out of a standard Accumulo installation, these scripts are new. You'll notice there's a script for each type of Accumulo component, so GC, master, monitor, T-server, etc. All of those are basically wrappers around the Accumulo script, and the Accumulo script is what has methods for the individual commands that might be sent to the component. So this is how you start the monitor or stop the monitor or configure the monitor. Let's see. The Accumulo configuration essentially just sets up the whole Accumulo conf directory. And the params files essentially turn our configuration properties into Python variables so they can be used. Let's see. So, oops, I skipped the... This is what the meta info looks like. At the top, it basically tells what application it is, Accumulo 151. There's a quick links section, and that describes the information that's going to be published to the registry, in this case, the monitor URL. There's a section where you can specify what order you want operations to be performed in. This here says that the tablet server can't be started until the master is started. While that isn't normally a requirement for Accumulo, Accumulo has a step in its installation process that other long-lived applications Slider has installed doesn't have, which is the Accumulo initialization step that sets up the HDFS directory and the initial contents of Zookeeper. So basically in the Accumulo master script, it's performing that initialization if necessary when the master is started. And so that's why the other processes have to wait until the master has come up. Let's see. There's a section for each component, master, T-server, etc., and it describes which script is used to issue commands to that component. The resources JSON file also has a section for each component, but let's see. So this file goes with a specific instance of Accumulo. While the meta info is just about the app package, this says for this instance of Accumulo that I'm starting, give it this many T servers and this many masters, etc. The app config JSON file is where basically all the configuration properties go. At the bottom, we have like properties that would go into the Accumulo site file. You'll notice there are a couple of named properties that Slider will fill in for us that we're allowed to use, like ZK host. There's also a special variable name that basically goes component name dot allocated port, and in that case, Slider will choose a random port and then assign it to that value. Let's see. Above the site section, there are some global variables, and these are things that are needed by those scripts to configure and start up Accumulo. Things that would get filled into the Accumulo env file, etc. There are some properties that every application has, such as the logdir and the PID directory. And then at the very top, we have some configurations that Slider needs to know to run, which are the Java home and the location of the app package in HDFS. These are just samplings. There are a lot more things in the actual file, but I wanted to give you a flavor for what this information looks like. So to install Slider, first you have to build it. We're only doing source releases at this point, mainly because they're easier to do at Apache. But it's pretty easy to build. You can just do a Maven clean package and definitely skip the tests because they're hard to configure to run correctly. But you take the tarball, untar it into the desired directory, edit the Slider configuration file, and tell it where the yarn jars are, where the location of the running Zookeeper hosts are, the location of the resource manager and the scheduler address, and then where HDFS is. There are also a few things you have to throw into HDFS. One is that Accumulo App Package. Also the agent tar, which is going to contain that agent provider and app master code. And there's also an agent configuration file that you can basically just copy straight from the tarball and drop into HDFS. So once you have that all set up, to create an Accumulo instance, you just do Slider create and instance name. This is not the Accumulo instance name. It's a Slider application instance name. You have to give it the location of the tarball and then an app config and resources JSON file, like the ones I showed you a little while ago. Then once the cluster is running, you can execute other Slider operations on it, freeze, thaw, destroy, and flex. I don't know if any of you saw the Hoya commands we used from about last October, but these look a lot better than those did. So, I mean, the CLI is great, but really we would also like this to be able to hook into management frameworks. For example, it would be great if it hooked into Apache Ambari. If you're not familiar, Ambari is an open source tool for managing and monitoring Hadoop installations. They recently added something new called Ambari Views, which allow you to put in like custom UI elements. And so we have a slider view that hooks into the slider CLI, and it can execute the slider commands for you and also list the current slider apps. And this is where I'm going to go into. So you can see this is the Ambari dashboard. It's just installed on my local VM, so not very exciting. But this is what the main dashboard page looks like. And then over here, which is unfortunately slightly off the page, you can click onto the slider view, which just lists the existing slider apps. I only have one that was there that's now frozen, but I can create a new one of Accumulo. Click next. You have to tell it how much memory you want for each container. Accumulo is also slightly unusual of these long-lived apps because a lot of them have like master and worker nodes, but Accumulo has all these different kinds of processes it likes to start. Most of them are singleton ones. The tablet server is the main worker nodes that you'll have a lot of. And then you have an option to edit some of the site information. I'm going to make sure it has a unique directory in HDFS. But all that information is fine for defaults. And so now it's going to start up an Accumulo instance. It'll take it a couple minutes to get that going. So now sort of it's aware of all of the containers for each of those different kinds of processes, but they're still starting up and being installed on the individual machines. They're sort of like the install command is a separate command from the start, so there are like multiple round trips between the agent and app master. Under this quick links section, you can go to the Yarn general status page, and you can click through to the app master tracking URL, which has a bunch of information, including like the containers where the various processes are running, etc. And eventually, the monitor URL gets registered back into the registry, and that propagates to this quick links section too. So I can click on UI, and the Accumulo monitor page for the instance I just started comes up. Don't worry about these logs. They're just swapping as warnings. And then you can execute actions on this. I can freeze it or flex it. What's flex do? Flex is for basically changing the number of T servers you're running, or adding a master, or making it smaller, etc. I think you might be able to tweak configs as well. So like if you wanted to change the heap size for various processes, you could do it there. Okay, so just a really small demo. If anybody wants to play around with that more, feel free to find me afterwards. So next in Slider, our goals are we really want to sort of lock down the app package format. It's actually very similar to the Ambari stack definition format, but there are some slight differences. The registry work is now in Slider, but we'd really like to push that down into Yarn so that other things can take advantage of it. Also, the current implementation is based on a curator design pattern, and I think they're going to make it more of a standalone thing as well. We want to do better with more failure handling and testing and making it easier to do debugging, make sure the security is good, and we really want more app packages developed, so a lot more long-lived applications can be deployed on Slider, and that will help us find areas where we need to improve Slider as well. Specifically in Yarn, there's an entire ticket about long-lived applications that has a lot of subtasks and related tickets. I also showed the same list last October, and there's been some progress since then. Handling AM, the app master restart, has mostly been completed now. We still need to do better with token renewal, doing better signaling in containers, gang scheduling, handling anti-affinity request, which would be like, I don't want there ever to be more than one T server on the same node, and doing better with managing logging. Well, as an incubator project, we're really actively looking for feedback on Slider and interested in people trying it out and getting involved. Again, probably the easiest way to get involved is to try out new app packages. I think probably we'll put in Flume pretty soon, and someone opened a ticket about doing Spark on Slider, although I'm not sure if they're intending on contributing the app package or not. And that's all. Does anyone have any questions? I'm fairly certain that this will be integrated with HTTP at some point, yes. I think it will be the next official release, or possibly the one after that, yeah.
So it looks like you have to do a lot of stuff that you maybe used to have to do with Puppet or other custom configuration things. Have you seen people producing their Puppet scripts using Yarn to take care of lots of different after that?
I guess I haven't you guys probably couldn't hear the question. The question was whether we're seeing a move from people doing a lot of things with Puppet to doing more with Yarn. I haven't specifically seen that, but then I haven't been talking to a lot of people who previously used Puppet. There are people definitely who are excited about using this. That's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure we've even done a lot of thinking about that yet, but that's definitely something we should at least provide recommendations on. Yeah.
I will turn around like a potential dead. If I'm doing preemption, I could deadlock shutting down Accumulo as an input source while I'm running that reduce on it, or vice versa.
Yeah, that's a good point. Scheduling when you're running long-lived apps and shorter-lived apps at the same time. I'd be surprised if there weren't something about that in the Yarn 896 ticket, but I'll have to take a look and see. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Feel free to grab me afterwards if there's anything else.